often remembered for its mix of absurd escalation and character-driven tension, centers around a seemingly simple premise that spirals into a full-blown workplace identity crisis when WNYX becomes obsessed with the idea of image, perception, and how they are seen both internally and externally. And it all begins when Dave Nelson receives feedback from upper management suggesting that the station's brand feels outdated and unfocused. A vague but deeply unsettling critique that immediately sends him into overthinking mode, because Dave is exactly the kind of person who can handle concrete problems but completely unravels when faced with abstract judgment. And as he shares this concern with the staff, hoping for constructive ideas, he instead unleashes a chain reaction of insecurity, ego, and wildly misguided attempts at reinvention, with Bill McNeil taking the critique as a personal attack on his on-air persona and deciding that what the station needs is a more serious tone, which for him translates into adopting an exaggerated, almost parody-level version of a hard-hitting journalist, complete with overly dramatic delivery and self-important commentary that quickly becomes unbearable for everyone else. While Lisa Miller interprets the feedback as a call for professionalism and structure, pushing for stricter guidelines, polished segments, and a more cohesive identity that clashes with the chaotic energy that defines WNYX, leading her to clash with both Bill's theatrics and Joe Gorelli's complete disregard for any kind of branding logic, as Joe argues that the station's unpredictability is its strength and that trying to standardize it would strip away what makes it unique, framing the entire concept of brand identity as a corporate illusion that suppresses authenticity. And Matthew, caught in the middle as usual, tries desperately to align himself with whichever perspective seems most correct at any given moment, resulting in him constantly switching positions mid-conversation and confusing everyone, including himself. While Catherine Duke observes the unfolding chaos with her characteristic dry wit, pointing out that none of them actually know what branding means in a practical sense and that they are all projecting their own insecurities onto a vague critique, a statement that is both accurate and largely ignored, and as Dave attempts to regain control by organizing a brainstorming session, the meeting devolves almost immediately into overlapping arguments, contradictory ideas, and increasingly ridiculous suggestions, such as rebranding the station as edgy and controversial, or as sophisticated and elite, or even as deliberately chaotic as a kind of anti-brand. Each proposal reflecting more about the person suggesting it than about the station itself. And the episode leans into this meta-commentary by showing how each character's vision for WNYX is essentially an extension of their own identity, with Bill wanting validation of his importance, Lisa seeking structure and recognition, Joe defending individuality, and Dave trying to reconcile all of it into something coherent, a task that proves nearly impossible. And in an attempt to gather external perspective, Dave arranges for a focus group to evaluate the station, which introduces a new layer of comedic tension as the staff becomes hyper-aware of being observed and judged, leading them to perform exaggerated versions of themselves in an effort to impress the group, only to receive feedback that is even more confusing and contradictory than the original critique, with some participants loving the chaos while others find it disorienting, some praising Bill's confidence while others find him insufferable. And this lack of consensus only deepens the internal conflict as each character selectively hears the feedback that validates their existing beliefs, further entrenching their positions. And as the situation escalates, the station's actual broadcast begins to reflect this identity crisis, with segments that feel disjointed, inconsistent, and overly self-conscious, as if the station is trying too hard to define itself instead of simply functioning naturally. And listeners begin to notice, calling in with mixed reactions that mirror the focus group's confusion, creating a feedback loop that amplifies the chaos rather than resolving it. And Dave, increasingly overwhelmed, starts to question his own leadership, wondering if he is the reason the station lacks a clear identity. A moment of vulnerability that contrasts with his usual attempts to maintain control, while Lisa pushes harder for structure, believing that clarity will come from discipline, and Joe pushes in the opposite direction, insisting that the station should embrace its randomness fully, turning the conflict into a philosophical battle between order and chaos, and Bill, meanwhile, becomes so committed to his serious journalist persona that he loses touch with reality, delivering broadcasts that are unintentionally comedic due to their over-the-top intensity, which ironically makes him more entertaining than ever, highlighting the central irony of the episode that authenticity often emerges when people stop trying so hard to be something specific. And as tensions reach their peak, the station teeters on the edge of complete dysfunction, with Dave unable to reconcile the competing visions, Lisa frustrated by the lack of progress, Joe increasingly detached, and Matthew overwhelmed by the constant shifts, until a moment of clarity emerges not from a grand realization, but from a small, almost accidental interaction, such as a spontaneous, unplanned segment that captures the natural dynamic of the group without any forced identity, reminding them, however briefly, of what makes the station work in the first place, and this moment serves as a turning point, allowing Dave to step back and recognize that the problem may not be the lack of a defined brand, but the attempt to artificially impose one, leading him to abandon the idea of forcing a cohesive identity and instead focus on supporting the strengths of his team as they are. A decision that brings a sense of relief, even if it does not resolve all conflicts, because Lisa still values structure, Joe still resists it, Bill still craves attention, and Matthew still struggles to find his place. But there is a renewed understanding that these differences are not necessarily weaknesses to be corrected, but elements of a larger, if messy, whole. And the episode concludes with a return to a more natural rhythm, the station settling back into its familiar blend of professionalism and chaos. With Dave cautiously optimistic, Lisa slightly more flexible, Joe quietly satisfied, Bill basking in his perceived success, and Matthew relieved to have survived another crisis, while Catherine delivers a final observation that encapsulates the episode's theme, suggesting that identity is not something you define once and for all, but something that emerges from consistent behavior over time. A line that lands with both humor and insight, reinforcing the idea that WNYX's true brand is simply the unpredictable, flawed, and strangely cohesive dynamic of the people who run it, and that any attempt to simplify that into a neat label will inevitably fall short, making the episode a sharp, funny, and surprisingly thoughtful exploration of how organizations and individuals alike struggle to define themselves in the face of external expectations, only to discover that the answer is often less about reinvention and more about acceptance of what already exists. And even after Dave makes the conscious decision to stop forcing a unified brand onto the station, the ripple effects of the earlier chaos don't just magically disappear, because once people start questioning who they are and how they're perceived, that kind of existential itch doesn't go away overnight. It lingers, pokes at them in quiet moments, and shows up in subtle behavioral shifts. So throughout the rest of the episode, there's this undercurrent of self-awareness running beneath the usual fast-talking chaos, where each character, whether they admit it or not, is still recalibrating how they present themselves, with Dave trying to lead in a slightly looser, more adaptive way, but clearly fighting the instincts to clamp down whenever things start to drift, which they inevitably do. Because this is WNYX and drift is basically the default setting, while Lisa experiments with loosening her grip just enough to allow spontaneity, but not enough to feel like she's losing control, resulting in this interesting push-pull where she approves something unconventional and then immediately try to structure it after the fact, creating a kind of controlled chaos that both helps and frustrates everyone around her, especially Joe, who senses even the slightest hint of imposed order and reacts to it like a cat being forced into water, doubling down on his anti-structure philosophy and leaning harder into bizarre ideas, not necessarily because they're good, but because they're free. And in his mind, freedom is inherently valuable regardless of outcome, and Bill, riding the high of his accidentally successful serious persona, starts to blur the line between performance and identity even further, occasionally slipping into dramatic delivery in completely inappropriate contexts, like casual conversations or mundane announcements, which confuses people at first, but gradually becomes part of the station's weird charm, even if no one wants to admit it out loud. And Matthew, meanwhile, becomes hyper-aware of how he is perceived by others, overanalyzing every interaction and trying to adjust his behavior in real time to fit what he thinks is expected, which of course backfires because his attempts at self-correction only make him seem more awkward, creating a loop where he keeps trying to fix the impression he's making and ends up reinforcing it instead. And Catherine continues to act as the quiet anchor of reality, occasionally dropping observations that cut through everyone's self-delusion, pointing out, for example, that the more they try to control how they're perceived, the less authentic they become, which is both obvious and somehow still ignored because acknowledging it would require them to actually change. And as the episode stretches further into its extended narrative, it begins to highlight how external validation plays a disproportionate role in shaping their internal sense of identity, with small pieces of feedback, whether from callers, management, or even each other, taking on outsized importance, influencing decisions and moods in ways that feel both exaggerated and uncomfortably relatable. And there's a particularly telling sequence where the station receives a mix of positive and negative listener responses in rapid succession, causing the entire team to swing emotionally from confidence to doubt and back again within minutes, illustrating just how unstable their sense of self becomes when it's tied closely to outside opinion. And Dave, watching this emotional whiplash unfold, starts to understand that part of his job isn't just managing logistics, but also buffering the team from overreacting to every piece of feedback. A realization that pushes him slightly closer to becoming a more balanced leader, even if he's still far from mastering it. And Lisa, in parallel, begins to recognize that her desire for perfection can sometimes stifle the very qualities that make the station engaging, leading her to make small but meaningful adjustments in how she approaches her work, allowing for imperfections that feel more genuine, while Joe remains largely unchanged on the surface but subtly more engaged with the group, as if the whole ordeal has reaffirmed his belief that authenticity matters, even if he expresses it in his usual unconventional way. And Bill, despite all his posturing, has fleeting moments where he questions whether people like him for who he is or just for the persona he projects, though he quickly buries those thoughts under layers of confidence because introspection is not exactly his comfort zone. And Matthew continues his internal struggle to define himself, occasionally landing on moments of clarity where he simply acts without overthinking and, in those brief instances, actually comes across as competent and likable, hinting at a version of himself that could exist if he ever stopped trying so hard to be something specific. And as the episode moves toward its closing stretch, all of these threads begin to converge into a quiet but meaningful resolution. Not in the sense that everything is neatly solved, but in the sense that each character reaches a temporary equilibrium, a point where they are slightly more aware of their tendencies and slightly less controlled by them. And the station itself settles into a rhythm that feels less forced, more organic, as if it has remembered how to just exist without overdefinition. And the final moments reinforce this idea with a return to normal operations that feels subtly different, not because the structure has changed, but because the perspective has, with Dave choosing not to overcorrect a minor issue, Lisa allowing a segment to unfold naturally, Joe participating without immediately disrupting, Bill delivering a performance that is confident but not overly theatrical, and Matthew completing a task without second-guessing himself, all small actions that collectively suggest growth without announcing it. And Catherine, observing this, offers one last understated remark that ties everything together, noting that maybe the station doesn't need to figure out what it is as long as it keeps working. A line that lands as both a joke and a genuine insight, because in the end, the episode argues that identity, whether personal or organizational, is less about defining yourself in a fixed way and more about consistently showing up, making choices, and letting those choices accumulate into something recognizable over time, even if it's messy, inconsistent, and impossible to neatly label, which, in the case of WNYX, is exactly what makes it work.